The small coastal village of Punta Verde sat nestled between rolling hills and the deep blue sea. Everyone knew everyone in this tight-knit community, but no one was more beloved than old Maria Solano. At 94 years of age, her body had grown frail, but her eyes still sparkled with the same wisdom and kindness that had drawn people to her doorstep for nearly 7 decades. Maria lived in a modest stone cottage at the edge of the village, surrounded by a garden that bloomed year-round, despite the changing seasons. Flowers that botanists claimed couldn't grow together thrived side by side, and herbs with conflicting needs somehow flourished under her care. Local children whispered that Maria could talk to plants, and truthfully, the old woman could often be seen murmuring to her garden in the early morning light. People came to Maria from all corners of the region seeking help. A young mother with a baby who wouldn't stop crying. A fisherman with hands crippled by years of pulling nets. A teacher plagued by migraines that no doctor could cure. Maria turned no one away, regardless of their ability to pay. Some brought fresh fish or homemade bread as thanks. Others could offer nothing but gratitude, which Maria accepted with the same warm smile. "My grandmother taught me, who learned from her grandmother before her," Maria would explain when asked about her remarkable healing abilities. She never called herself a doctor or claimed any special powers. "I just know which plants help which troubles, that's all," she would say with a humble shrug that fooled no one. Luisa, the village schoolteacher, had witnessed Maria's unexplainable gifts firsthand. 20 years ago, Luisa's son had fallen from a cliff while playing with friends. The local doctor had shaken his head grimly, explaining that the boy's injuries were too severe. "Prepare yourselves," he had told the family. But Maria had arrived with her worn leather bag of remedies, shooing the doctor away with surprising authority for such a small woman. For 3 days and nights, Maria had sat beside the boy's bed, applying strange-smelling poultices to his wounds and feeding him broths made from plants that grew in no local garden. She whispered things that Luisa couldn't quite hear, words in a language that sounded ancient and powerful. On the 4th morning, the boy opened his eyes and asked for water, his injuries healing faster than medically possible. Today, that same boy worked as a boat captain, taking tourists along the coastline, telling them tales of the village healer, who had saved his life with magic. Maria always clicked her tongue in disapproval whenever she heard these stories. "Not magic," she would correct firmly. "Just knowledge. Knowledge and care." But there were aspects of Maria's abilities that even she didn't explain. Like how she always appeared at a villager's door exactly when needed, often before they realized they needed help themselves. Or how she could predict storms days before the weather changed, warning fishermen to stay ashore on days that dawned clear, but ended in raging tempests. The most curious thing about Maria was her collection of animal companions. Birds would perch on her windowsills each morning, seemingly reporting the day's news. Stray dogs followed her through the village streets, forming an unlikely parade. But most unusual was her relationship with the snakes that lived in the rocky outcroppings near her home. While most villagers feared these creatures, Maria treated them like old friends. People swore they had seen her deep in conversation with a particularly large emerald green snake that sometimes sunned itself on the stone wall surrounding her garden. Children who ventured too close to snake territories would find Maria suddenly beside them, gently guiding them away without fear. "The snakes protect our village," she once told a group of wide-eyed children during a rare visit to the schoolhouse. "They keep the balance of things. Always remember to respect them, and they will respect you." Few knew that Maria's connection to these creatures went far deeper than friendly coexistence. In the privacy of her home, late at night when the village slept, Maria kept detailed journals written in a flowing script. These books, hidden beneath a loose floorboard under her bed, contained secrets passed down through generations of women in her family line. Secrets about a covenant formed centuries ago between the people of this land and the powerful spirits that dwelled within it. The journals spoke of a time when drought and disease had nearly wiped out the original settlement. In desperation, Maria's ancestor, a woman named Anna, had ventured into the sacred caves in the cliffs and made a pact with the guardian spirits. These spirits, which took the form of great serpents in the physical world, would protect the village and ensure its prosperity. In exchange, one woman from each generation would serve as the keeper of this covenant, maintaining the delicate balance between the human world and the spirit realm. For nearly 70 years, Maria had fulfilled this role with unwavering dedication. She had never married or had children of her own, dedicating her life instead to caring for the entire village. But she had chosen a successor, her great-niece Elena, a quiet girl who shared Maria's affinity for plants and healing. Maria had been teaching Elena in secret for years, preparing her for the responsibility she would one day inherit. What Maria hadn't told Elena was how soon that day would come. 3 nights before her death, Maria dreamed of the great emerald, Snake. In her dream, the creature spoke to her with the voice of all her ancestors combined. "Your time draws to a close," it told her. "The transition approaches. Are you prepared?" Maria awoke knowing her death was imminent. With calm acceptance, she spent her final days putting her affairs in order. She organized her remedies, completed treatments for those currently under her care, and added the final entries to her journal. On her last evening, as the sun set over the sea, turning the water to liquid gold, Maria sat in her garden surrounded by the plants she had nurtured for decades. The emerald snake appeared silently, slithering across the warm stones to rest beside her chair. "Will it hurt?" Maria asked, her wrinkled hand gently stroking the snake's smooth head. The snake's tongue flickered out, tasting the air. "No more than falling asleep," it seemed to answer, though no sound passed between them. Maria nodded, satisfied. "And Elena? Will she be ready?" The snake's eyes, deep and knowing, met hers. "That is not for us to know. Each keeper finds her own way. Trust the girl as your grandmother trusted you." Maria smiled at this reminder. She had been young and frightened too when the responsibility first passed to her. Yet somehow, she had found the strength to carry it. Elena would do the same. As night fell, Maria felt a deep weariness settle into her bones. She knew she would not see another sunrise. With the snake still beside her, she closed her eyes for the final time, her last thoughts not of fear, but of gratitude for the life she had lived and the village she had served. The next morning, young Tomas, who delivered fresh milk to Maria each day, found her still sitting in her garden chair, a peaceful expression on her face. The village mourned deeply, businesses closing out of respect, fishing boats remaining docked in the harbor. Everyone had a story about how Maria had helped them or their family. The grief was personal and profound. No one noticed that in the days following Maria's death, the animals around the village grew restless. Birds circled in unusual patterns. The stray dogs howled through the night. And the snakes, particularly the large emerald one that had been Maria's companion, seemed to have vanished completely from their usual haunts. What the villagers also didn't know was that Maria's spirit had not fully departed. According to the ancient covenant, the transition of power required a ceremony, one that hadn't taken place before her death. Now, caught between worlds, Maria watched as preparations were made for her funeral, unable to communicate the urgency of what needed to happen next. As Elena helped arrange the funeral service, overwhelmed by both grief and newfound responsibility, she had no idea that the peaceful farewell planned for her great-aunt would soon be disrupted in the most dramatic and inexplicable way, one that would reveal the true nature of Maria's role in the village and change Elena's life forever. Tiril. Village church stood on the highest point of Punta Verde, its whitewashed walls gleaming in the morning sun. Inside, wooden pews worn smooth by generations of faithful villagers were filled to capacity. Those who couldn't find seats stood along the walls, spilling out the doors and into the courtyard. Nearly everyone from the village had come to say goodbye to Maria Solano. Elena sat in the front row, her dark hair pulled back in a simple braid, her eyes red-rimmed from days of crying. At 26, she had never known a world without her great-aunt's guidance. Now she felt adrift, clutching the small key Maria had given her months ago with instructions to use it when the time comes. Elena had no idea what the key opened, or when this mysterious time might arrive. Father Thomas, the village priest who had known Maria all his life, spoke warmly of her generosity and healing gifts. Maria never claimed her abilities came from anything but God's grace, he said, though his eyes showed he knew there was more to her powers than divine blessing alone. She served this community with her whole heart, asking nothing in return. As the priest spoke, Elena noticed something odd. A subtle vibration seemed to be running through the floorboards beneath her feet. She glanced around, but no one else appeared to notice. The sensation grew stronger, like the distant rumble of approaching thunder, though the sky outside remained clear blue. Maria's simple wooden coffin rested at the front of the church, adorned with wildflowers from her garden. Following local tradition, the lid remained open for mourners to pay their final respects. Maria looked peaceful, dressed in her favorite blue dress, her wrinkled hands folded over a sprig of rosemary for remembrance, as she had often said. As the service drew to a close, Father Thomas invited the villagers to come forward one by one to say their goodbyes. Louisa, the schoolteacher, went first, placing a handwritten letter in the coffin. "For everything you did for my son," she whispered, touching Maria's cold hand briefly, before moving away with tears streaming down her face. Old Rodrigo, the fisherman, whose twisted hands Maria had eased with her herbal wraps, placed his most prized possession, a perfect shell the color of sunrise, beside her. Each villager brought something, a flower, a keepsake, a whispered thank you for some kindness Maria had shown them. Elena watched, her heart both breaking and swelling with pride at how deeply her great-aunt had been loved. The vibration beneath her feet continued, growing more insistent. A few other people were beginning to notice now, exchanging confused glances. When Elena's turn came, she approached the coffin slowly, her legs trembling. The key in her pocket seemed to grow heavier with each step. Standing before Maria's body, Elena was struck by how small and fragile her great-aunt looked in death, all the power and presence that had animated her now gone. "I don't know if I can do this without you," Elena whispered, placing a small bundle of herbs tied with twine next to Maria's hands. It contained sage, lavender, and a rare mountain herb that Maria had taught her was for protection during transitions. Elena had gathered them at dawn, following an impulse she didn't quite understand. As her fingers brushed against Maria's cold skin, the vibration beneath the church floor suddenly intensified. Several gasps rose from the congregation as the candles near the altar flickered wildly, their flames stretching impossibly tall before shrinking back to normal. Father Thomas paused in his reading, looking up with concern. "Perhaps a small earthquake," he suggested, though earthquakes were rare in this region. Elena felt a strange certainty that this was no natural phenomenon. The key in her pocket had grown warm, almost hot against her thigh. She stepped back from the coffin, her heart racing. As the last villager finished paying respects, Father Thomas moved to close the coffin lid. The moment his hands touched the wood, a sound like rushing wind filled the church. The doors at the back slammed shut with a bang that made everyone jump. "What on earth?" Father Thomas began, but his words died in his throat. Movement inside the coffin caught everyone's attention. At first, people thought it was just a trick of the light or perhaps a flower shifting. Then, unmistakably, something long and sinuous rose up beside Maria's body. A woman in the third row screamed. A child pointed. "Snake! Snake!" Panic erupted as people recognized the large emerald snake that had been Maria's constant companion. Somehow, impossibly, it had appeared inside the sealed coffin. 6 feet of muscular, gleaming scales coiled beside Maria's body, its triangular head rising. To survey the chaos unfolding in the church, people scrambled toward the exits, pushing and shoving in their haste to escape. Mothers grabbed their children. Old men crossed themselves frantically. Even Father Thomas backed away, his prayer book held before him like a shield. Only Elena remained still, rooted to the spot. In the midst of the panic and screaming, she felt an unexpected sense of calm wash over her. The snake turned its head toward her, its eyes reflecting an intelligence that seemed almost human. Elena knew, without understanding how she knew, that this creature meant her no harm. "Everyone, please," she shouted, raising her hands. Her voice, usually soft, carried with unexpected authority through the church. "Don't be afraid. This was Maria's friend." Few heeded her words. The exodus continued until only a handful of people remained inside the church. Elena, Father Thomas, Luisa the schoolteacher, old Rodrigo, and a few others who had been especially close to Maria. The snake made no move to leave the coffin. Instead, it settled itself more comfortably beside Maria's body, coiling partially around her arm as if protecting her. Most shocking of all, a soft green luminescence had begun to emanate from its scales, casting an otherworldly glow throughout. "The church, this is unnatural," Father Thomas whispered, crossing himself again. "We must call someone to remove it." "No," Elena said firmly, surprising herself with her certainty. "The snake is supposed to be here." "What do you mean, child?" Luisa asked, her voice shaking. "How could a snake get inside a sealed coffin?" Elena shook her head, unable to explain the conviction she felt. "I don't know exactly, but this feels right somehow. Maria always said the snakes protected our village." The key in her pocket now felt like it was pulsing with heat. Old Rodrigo, who had lived in the village longer than anyone, stepped forward with the aid of his walking stick. His rheumy eyes narrowed as he studied the scene before him. "My grandmother used to tell stories," he said slowly, his voice gravelly with age. "About the old ways before the church came. About women who could speak to spirits and animals that carried messages between worlds." He looked at Elena with newfound respect. She said these things were forgotten, but not gone. The snake's head swiveled toward Rodrigo as if acknowledging his words. The green glow intensified, bathing Maria's peaceful face in emerald light. "We should continue with the service," Elena said suddenly, the words coming from somewhere deep inside her. "We should honor Maria as she would have wanted." "Father." Thomas looked deeply uncertain, but after a moment's hesitation he nodded. "Very well. But the coffin remains open. I will not approach that creature." The remaining mourners gathered closer, forming a tight circle around the coffin. Their fear was slowly giving way to wonder as the snake remained perfectly still, its presence somehow making Maria's death seem less final, less absolute. Father Thomas resumed the funeral rites, his voice steadier than Elena expected. As he spoke the ancient words of farewell, the green light from the snake's scales pulsed gently, like a heartbeat. Elena found herself breathing in rhythm with that light, a strange peace settling over her despite the extraordinary circumstances. When the service concluded, the question of burial arose. The cemetery lay behind the church, rows of stone markers stretching toward the sea. "We cannot bury her with that thing still in there," one of the village elders argued. Before anyone could respond, the snake raised its head higher and let out a soft hiss that somehow carried to every corner of the church. The message was clear, though no words were spoken. The burial would wait. As twilight approached, news of the snake's appearance had spread throughout the village. People gathered at a safe distance from the church, their fear mixed with curiosity. Some of the older villagers recalled stories their grandparents had told them, tales of special women who communed with nature spirits, of sacred pacts and protections that kept their village safe through storms and droughts. Inside the church, Elena sat vigil beside her great-aunt's coffin. The snake remained coiled around Maria's arm, its green glow providing the only light as darkness fell. Father Thomas had reluctantly agreed to leave them alone, extracting a promise from Elena to call for help if the snake showed any sign of aggression. As midnight approached, Elena found herself growing drowsy. The events of the day had left her, emotionally exhausted. Just as her eyes began to close, the snake moved, slithering from the coffin onto the church floor. Elena froze, suddenly wide awake. The snake paused before her, its body still emitting that strange green light. Then, deliberately, it began moving toward the church door. At the threshold, it stopped and turned its head, looking back at Elena expectantly. Understanding dawned. "You want me to follow you," she whispered. The snake's tongue flickered out, tasting the air. It waited. With one last glance at Maria's peaceful form, Elena rose and followed the snake out into the night, the mysterious key burning in her pocket, like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Behind them, unnoticed, a single green scale remained on Maria's chest, directly over her heart, pulsing with a light that seemed to reach deep into her still form, as if something essential was being preserved, waiting for what would come next. The emerald snake led Elena through the sleeping village, its scales glowing softly in the darkness like a living lantern. They moved past shuttered houses where villagers slept uneasily, many still unsettled by the day's strange events. Dogs that would normally bark at nighttime visitors fell silent as the snake passed, watching with alert but calm eyes. Elena followed, in a dreamlike state, questions swirling through her mind. How had the snake appeared in the sealed coffin? What did it want from her? The key in her pocket still radiated warmth against her thigh, somehow connected to whatever was happening. Instead of heading toward Maria's cottage as Elena expected, the snake led her to the edge of the village where the land rose steeply toward the cliffs. A narrow path, barely visible in the moonlight, wound upward through dense underbrush. Elena hesitated. This area had always been forbidden. Maria had warned her countless times never to venture into these hills alone. The snake paused, turning its head to look back at her, its eyes reflecting the moonlight. Something in that steady gaze gave Elena courage. Taking a deep breath, she continued following as the path grew steeper and more treacherous. After nearly an hour of climbing, they reached a rock formation that Elena had seen from a distance but never visited. Huge boulders balanced impossibly on one another, creating what looked like a natural doorway. The snake slithered through this opening and disappeared. Elena stood before the stone arch, heart pounding. Every instinct told her to turn back, to run to the safety of the village below. But the key in her pocket suddenly grew almost painfully hot, as if urging her forward. Gathering her courage, she squeezed through the narrow opening. Inside, she discovered a small cave, its walls smooth as if worn by water or countless hands over centuries. The snake waited in the center, coiled upon a flat stone that resembled an altar. Behind it, barely visible in the dim light, was what appeared to be a small door set into the rock wall. Elena approached slowly, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. The snake uncoiled slightly, revealing a keyhole in the center of the stone door. A keyhole that looked exactly the right size for the key she carried. With trembling fingers, Elena removed the key from her pocket. It glowed faintly now, matching the green luminescence of the snake. As she inserted it into the lock, the cave filled with a sound like distant chimes. The door swung open, revealing a small chamber beyond. Inside, stone shelves lined the walls, holding dozens of leather-bound books identical to the journal Elena had sometimes glimpsed Maria writing in late at night. On a pedestal in the center sat a clay bowl filled with clear water that somehow captured and reflected the moonlight from above, illuminating the entire space. The snake slithered to the pedestal and dipped its head toward the water. The surface rippled, though nothing had touched it, and images began to form like a living painting. Elena gasped as she recognized Maria's face, younger than she had ever seen her in life. The image shifted, showing other women through the ages, all with the same determined eyes and gentle hands. The last face to appear was Elena's own. "I don't understand," she whispered. The snake moved again, nudging one of the books from the lowest shelf. It fell open to reveal pages covered in flowing script, Maria's handwriting. Elena knelt to read. "To my dear Elena, if you are reading this, then I have passed from this world and the guardian has chosen you as the next keeper of the covenant. Do not be afraid. This is your birthright as it was mine and my grandmother's before me." Elena read until dawn broke, learning of the ancient pact between the village and the nature spirits that protected it. She learned how, centuries ago, during a terrible drought, her ancestor Anna had offered herself as a living bridge between the human and spirit worlds. In exchange for this service, the spirits, embodied in the form of the great emerald snake, would ensure the village's prosperity. For generations, a chosen woman from their bloodline had served as keeper, maintaining the balance between worlds. Now, with Maria gone, that responsibility fell to Elena. As first light touched the cave entrance, Elena gathered the most important journals and, with the snake leading the way, returned to the village below. What she saw there made her stop, in her tracks. Overnight, the village had transformed. The fields surrounding Punta Verde, which had been struggling after months of too little rain, now burst with healthy crops. The small stream that provided fresh water ran fuller than it had in years, its clear waters sparkling in the morning sun. Most remarkable of all were the villagers themselves. Luisa's daughter, Anna, who had suffered from terrible asthma since birth, ran through the village square breathing easily for the first time in her life. Old Rodrigo stood straighter, his gnarled hands flexing with newfound mobility as he prepared his fishing nets without pain. A miracle, people whispered as Elena passed. They eyed the snake with cautious respect rather than fear now, some even bowing their heads slightly as it slithered alongside her. At Maria's cottage, Elena found the garden exploding with new growth. Plants that shouldn't bloom for months displayed, vibrant flowers, their scent filling the air with sweetness. The snake moved to the stone wall surrounding the garden and coiled there, watching as Elena unlocked the door with her own key, the first time she had entered since Maria's death. Inside, everything remained as Maria had left it. Herbs hung drying from the rafters. Jars of remedies lined the shelves, and Maria's rocking chair sat empty beside the hearth. Elena placed the journals on the table and sank into the chair, suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had happened. According to Maria's writings, the days following the transition between keepers would be marked by abundance as the spirits renewed their covenant with the village. But there would also be signs that the boundary between worlds had temporarily thinned, phenomena that might frighten those who didn't understand. As if confirming this warning, strange reports began to reach Elena throughout the day. Villagers spoke of household items moving on their own. Fishermen described seeing faces in the waves. Children claimed their toys played by themselves when no one was watching. Most unsettling were the dreams. By nightfall, nearly every villager reported dreaming of Maria walking through their homes accompanied by the emerald snake. In these dreams, Maria seemed to be inspecting something invisible to the dreamer, looking into their hearts. One old woman described it as if measuring their worthiness. Elena felt the villagers' unease growing despite the blessings they had received. Father Tomas came to the cottage as the sun was setting, his expression troubled. "People are frightened, Elena," he said, carefully avoiding looking directly at the emerald snake that had taken up residence on the garden wall. "These occurrences, they're not natural. They're not harmful either," Elena replied with more confidence than she felt. "The dreams, the moving objects, they'll stop soon. It's just part of the transition." Father Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Transition? What exactly do you know about all this?" Elena hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. The journals made it clear that while some aspects of the covenant could be shared, its deepest secrets were for the keeper alone. Throughout history, the village church had alternately supported and opposed the keepers, depending on the temperament of its priests. "I know that Maria protected this village in ways beyond her healing work," Elena said carefully, "and now that responsibility has passed to me." Before Father Thomas could respond, a commotion arose from the village center. They hurried to investigate, and found a crowd gathered around the old well. The water, which had always been clear and sweet, now glowed with the same green luminescence as the snake's scales. "It's undrinkable," a woman cried, holding up a bucket of the glowing liquid. "Actually, no," contradicted another villager, an older man who had already taken a sip. "It tastes better than ever. And look." He held up his hand where a burn from his blacksmith's forge had been festering for weeks. Before their eyes, the wound was healing, the angry red flesh fading to healthy pink. Soon others were drinking from the well, exclaiming over its sweet taste and the immediate relief of various ailments. Father Thomas watched with a mixture of wonder and concern. "This is beyond my understanding," he admitted quietly to Elena. "Mine too," she confessed. but I'm learning. That night, as Elena studied Maria's journals by candlelight, she discovered entries describing similar events during previous transitions. The abundance would last 7 days, a time of healing and renewal for the village. But the journal also contained a warning. If the proper succession ritual wasn't completed by the 7th day, the covenant would be broken, and the village would lose its protection forever. The ritual described was complex, requiring ingredients Elena had never heard of, and words in a language she didn't recognize. Worse, it needed to be performed at the sacred cave during the full moon, which was exactly 7 days away. As Elena finally drifted to sleep in Maria's bed, the emerald snake coiled protectively at her feet. Her dreams were filled with visions of the village in flames, crops withering, the sea rising to swallow the land. She woke with the first light, the snake watching her with knowing eyes as if it had shared her nightmares. Elena realized she had only 7 days to master generations of secret knowledge, perform an ancient ritual, and convince a village increasingly divided between wonder and fear that the strange events were not a curse but a blessing. The weight of responsibility settled over her like a heavy cloak as she rose to face her first full day as keeper of the covenant. Dawn broke over Punta Verde with unusual brilliance, casting golden light across the transformed village. Elena had barely slept, spending most of the night poring over Maria's journals by candlelight. Her eyes burned from reading the faded handwriting, and her mind swirled with ancient words and strange instructions. The emerald snake had remained with her through the night, sometimes watching her read, other times slithering around the cottage as if searching for something. Elena still felt a mixture of awe and unease in its presence, but the fear was fading with each passing hour. Outside, the village continued its miraculous transformation. Flowers bloomed in places where nothing had grown in living memory. Fruit trees bent low with the weight of perfectly ripe produce, despite being out of season. The fish practically jumped into the villagers' nets, and the previously modest morning catch now filled boat after boat. But alongside these blessings, the unsettling phenomena had intensified. Objects moved when no one was looking. Voices whispered from empty rooms. Children reported seeing strange lights dancing above the water at night, and the dreams continued. Maria walking through homes with the emerald snake examining the villagers' hearts. As Elena prepared a simple breakfast of bread and honey, a frantic knocking came at the door. She opened it to find Louisa, the school teacher, standing there with a troubled expression. "You need to come quickly," Louisa said, glancing nervously at the snake coiled nearby. "Something's happening at the church." Elena grabbed her shawl and followed Louisa through the village. As they approached the church on the hill, Elena saw a crowd gathered outside, their faces a mixture of wonder and fear. Father Thomas stood at the entrance looking utterly bewildered. The reason became clear as Elena pushed through the crowd. The wooden statue of the Virgin Mary that had stood in the church for generations now glowed with the same green light as the snake's scales. More startling still, the statue's blank wooden eyes seemed to follow movements, and some villagers swore they had seen it turn its head. "This is blasphemy," one old woman muttered, crossing herself. "No, it's a sign of blessing." Another countered, "Look how the light matches the healing water in the well." Father Thomas approached Elena, his face pale. "Can you explain this?" he asked quietly. Elena hesitated. The journals had mentioned that during the transition period, the spirit world would make itself known in unexpected ways, but she hadn't anticipated anything like this. "It's part of the change happening in the village," she said carefully. "It's not meant to frighten anyone or challenge your faith. It's just the other world reaching out to ours." "Other world?" Father Thomas repeated, his eyebrows rising. "What exactly have you discovered in Maria's home, Elena?" Before she could answer, a child's voice rose above the murmuring crowd. "Look, the snake is here." All eyes turned to see the emerald snake slithering up the church steps. People stepped back hurriedly, creating a path. The snake moved directly to Elena's side, then continued into the church, its scales glowing brighter as it approached the illuminated statue. To everyone's astonishment, the wooden figure of the Virgin inclined her head slightly toward the snake in what looked unmistakably like acknowledgement. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers. "They know each other," whispered Louisa, her eyes wide. Father Thomas looked from the statue to the snake, to Elena, his theological world clearly shaken. "What does this mean?" he asked. Elena thought of what she had read the night before, how the covenant predated the church's arrival in the village, how the early priests had initially tried to stop the keeper's work before eventually reaching an uneasy truce when they saw how the village thrived under the spirit's protection. "It means that there's no conflict between your faith and what's happening here," Elena said, surprising herself with her certainty. "Different paths to the same truth." The snake returned to her side, and together they left the stunned crowd, behind returning to Maria's cottage. Elena felt the weight of responsibility growing heavier. The journals had been clear. She had 6 days remaining to complete the ritual, or all these blessings would turn to curses. Back at the cottage, Elena spread the journals across the table, focusing on the details of the succession ritual. It required specific ingredients: water from the deepest part of the sea, soil from the highest cliff, a flame that had burned for 7 generations, and the freely given scale of the guardian, the emerald snake. Most challenging was the language of the ritual itself, words passed down through generations that Elena would need to memorize perfectly. The pronunciation guide in the journal used symbols she didn't recognize. As she struggled to make sense of it all, a knock came at the door. She opened it to find old Rodrigo, the fisherman whose hands had been healed by the transformation. "I came to help," he said simply, his weathered face solemn. "My grandmother was friend to a keeper long ago. She told me stories." Elena welcomed him in, noticing how he bowed respectfully to the snake before taking a seat at the table. His gnarled fingers traced the symbols in the journal. "I recognize these," he said, surprising her. "My grandmother taught me the old language, though she made me promise never to speak of it." Hope surged through Elena. "Can you teach me how to pronounce these words?" Rodrigo nodded. "That's why I'm here. There are others too. Not many, but a few of us who remember the old ways. The keeper was never meant to work alone." Throughout the day, more villagers arrived at the cottage. An old woman who knew which cave contained the eternal flame mentioned in the ritual. A young fisherman who could dive deeper than anyone else, offering to retrieve the water from the sea's depths. Louisa came with ancient songs that had been disguised as children's rhymes, but actually described the covenant in veiled terms. Nightfall, a small group had gathered in Maria's cottage, each person contributing some piece of knowledge or skill needed for the ritual. Elena listened in amazement as they shared stories passed down through generations. Stories of previous keepers, of times when the covenant had nearly been broken, of the consequences when the proper respect wasn't shown to the spirits. "Why? Didn't any of you speak of this before?" Elena asked. "Maria asked us to keep silent," Louisa explained. "She said the time wasn't right, that knowledge shared too soon could be dangerous. But now the guardian has chosen you," Rodrigo added, nodding toward the emerald snake. "And the village is changing. We can't pretend not to remember anymore." With their help, Elena began to understand the true nature of the covenant. It wasn't simply a pact for protection and prosperity. It was a recognition that the human world and spirit world were not separate but intertwined, that balance between them was necessary for both to thrive. The emerald snake, she learned, was more than just a messenger. It was the physical manifestation of the guardian spirit itself, allowing the formless energy of the spirit world to interact with the material realm. Through the keeper, it could channel its power to heal, protect, and nurture the village. On the 3rd day after Maria's death, Elena and her newfound helpers began gathering the items needed for the ritual. The young fisherman dove to retrieve water from the deepest trench offshore, returning with a small vial of water so cold it seemed to burn the skin. 2 brothers climbed to the highest cliff to collect soil from where the land met the sky. Rodrigo's granddaughter, a quiet girl with knowing eyes, led them to a hidden cave where a small flame had been tended by secret caretakers for generations. Only one ingredient remained, a freely given scale from the guardian. Elena looked at the emerald snake, uncertain how to ask for such a gift. To her surprise, the creature slithered to the center of the cottage floor and remained perfectly still. A single scale near its head began to glow more brightly than the others. "Its offering," whispered Rodrigo's granddaughter. With trembling fingers, Elena gently touched the glowing scale. It detached easily, falling into her palm like a drop of solid light. The snake showed no sign of pain, merely blinking its golden eyes slowly as if in approval. By the fourth day, tension in the village had grown. The miraculous changes continued, crops flourishing, fish abundant, ailments healing, but so did the unsettling phenomena. The statue in the church now wept green tears that formed small pools of healing water. Stone walls rippled like water when no one was looking directly at them. And at night, strange music drifted through the village, beautiful but unearthly. Some villagers embraced these wonders while others grew increasingly frightened. A small group, led by a merchant from the neighboring town who had no knowledge of the village's history, began to speak against Elena and the emerald snake, calling them unnatural, dangerous. Father Thomas found himself caught between factions. His theological training told him to reject such pagan practices, but he couldn't deny the good that was coming from the changes, or the way the Virgin's statue had acknowledged the snake. On the evening of the fifth day, as Elena practiced the ritual words with Rodrigo's help, shouting erupted from the village square. She rushed outside to find a confrontation underway. The merchant and his supporters stood on one side, carrying torches and tools that could easily become weapons. Facing them were the villagers who had embraced the covenant, including Luisa and Rodrigo. "This woman is bringing evil to our village," the merchant shouted, pointing at Elena. "And that creature is the devil's servant." "The snake and the keeper have protected this village for centuries," Rodrigo countered, his voice strong despite his age. "Look at our crops, our fish, our health." "Coincidence or trickery?" the merchant insisted. "What about the moving objects, the strange music, the dreams that haunt our sleep? These are not blessings but a curse." The crowd grew louder, divided and angry. Elena felt panic rising within her. The journals had warned that discord during the transition period could weaken the covenant. With just 2 days remaining before the full moon, she couldn't afford any delays or disruptions. As the argument threatened to turn violent, the emerald snake slithered forward into the space between the opposing groups. Its scales glowed with blinding intensity, casting green light across the entire square. The shouting died away as everyone stared in wonder and fear. Then, to Elena's astonishment, a soft voice spoke, not aloud, but somehow directly into the mind of everyone present. The voice was Maria's, but also older, as if many women spoke together through her. "Remember who you are," the voice said. "Remember the covenant that has sustained you. Division serves only the darkness." The green light pulsed once, brilliantly, then faded to its normal glow. The snake returned to Elena's side as the stunned villagers looked at one another in confusion and awe. In the silence that followed, Elena found her voice. "Tomorrow, I will answer your questions. I will explain what I can about what's happening to our village. But for now, please return to your homes. Trust that what's happening is not meant to harm but to heal." Slowly, reluctantly, the crowd dispersed. The merchant and his supporters retreated, though their expressions remained suspicious. As darkness fell over the village, Elena returned to the cottage, aware that time was running short. The ritual needed to be perfect, and she had just 1 day left to prepare. That night, as she finally drifted into exhausted sleep, Elena dreamed of Maria standing in the sacred cave, the emerald snake coiled beside her, both waiting expectantly. In the dream, Maria spoke only 4 words. "The covenant must endure." Elena woke with the first light, determination replacing her fear. Whatever happened, she would not let Maria down. She would not let the village down. The covenant would endure, if she could solve the final mysteries hidden in the ancient journals before the full moon rose tomorrow night. The morning of the 7th day dawned with an unnatural stillness. No birds sang in the trees surrounding Elena's cottage. No wind stirred the abundant flowers that now carpeted the village. Even the sea seemed to hold its breath, its waves barely disturbing the shore, as if the whole world waited for what would happen when night fell. Elena had barely slept. The final preparations for the ritual had consumed her, memorizing the ancient words that Rodrigo had taught her, gathering the 4 elements needed: the deep sea water, the high cliff soil, the eternal flame, and the freely given scale from the guardian snake. Each item now rested in a small clay vessel on Maria's table, glowing faintly with its own inner light. The emerald snake seemed agitated, moving restlessly around the cottage, sometimes disappearing for short periods before returning to check on Elena's progress. Its scales glowed brighter than ever, casting dancing green shadows across the walls. As Elena reviewed the ritual instructions one final time, a knock came at the door. She opened it to find Father Tomas standing there, his expression troubled. "Afor, I come in?" he asked, eyeing the snake cautiously. Elena stepped aside to let him enter. The priest moved carefully around the emerald snake, which watched him with unblinking golden eyes. "I've been praying all night for guidance," Father Thomas said, settling into a chair at the table. "This situation goes against everything I was taught in seminary." Elena waited, sensing he had more to say. "And yet," he continued, "I cannot deny what I've seen. The healing, the abundance, even the statue in my church responding to this creature." He gestured toward the snake. "Last night I dreamed of Maria. She showed me things, memories from long before my time. The history of this village, the covenant." "Then you understand what I must do tonight?" Elena asked. Father Thomas nodded slowly. "I believe I do, and I want to help." Relief washed over Elena. The priest's support would be invaluable in uniting the village, especially with the merchant and his followers still spreading fear. "There's something else you should know," Father Tomas said, leaning forward. "Last night I heard the merchant and his friends making plans. They intend to stop whatever you're planning to do at the cave tonight. They're convinced it's some kind of dark magic that will harm the village." Elena's heart sank. The journals had been explicit. Any disruption to the ritual could have disastrous consequences. The covenant required harmony, willing participation. Force or violence would shatter the delicate connection between worlds. "What can we do?" she asked. "I've called a special service at the church this afternoon," Father Thomas replied. "I've asked everyone to attend, including the merchants group. I thought perhaps if you explained what's happening, if people understood the true nature of the covenant." Elena considered this. The journals had spoken of secrecy, of knowledge shared only with those who needed it. But perhaps those old restrictions had contributed to the current division. Perhaps transparency was the only way forward. "I'll come," she agreed. "I'll tell them what I can." The church was packed that afternoon, every bench filled, people standing along the walls and spilling out the doors. Elena sat in the front row, the emerald snake coiled beside her, causing nearby villagers to edge away nervously. Father Thomas spoke first, his voice steady and reassuring as he addressed the crowd. "Friends, neighbors, we face unusual circumstances in our village. Many of you are frightened, confused. Some see blessings in these changes, others see danger." He gestured toward Elena. "I've asked Elena to speak to us about what's happening, to share what she has learned from Maria's legacy." As Elena rose to address the village, she felt a momentary panic. She was no public speaker. Before Maria's death, she had been a quiet young woman who preferred plants to people. But as she looked out at the sea of familiar faces, people she had known all her life, she found her voice. "The story I'm going to tell you is our story, the true history of Punta Verde," she began. "Long ago, when this was just a small settlement struggling to survive, there was a terrible drought. Crops failed, children starved, the sea seemed empty of fish. In desperation, a woman named Anna ventured into the sacred caves in the cliffs. Elena told them of the covenant Anna had made with the spirits of the land and sea, how she had offered herself as a bridge between worlds. She explained how this pact had sustained the village for generations, bringing prosperity in exchange for respect and balance. Each generation, a keeper is chosen to maintain this balance, she continued. Maria was our keeper for nearly 70 years. Now that she has passed, the responsibility has come to me. She described the ritual that needed to be performed that night, not in technical detail but enough that they understood its purpose, to renew the covenant, to ensure the village's continued protection. The strange things you've seen, the moving objects, the dreams, the glowing water, these are temporary, just signs of the spirit world drawing closer during this transition time, she assured them. After tonight, things will return to normal, but the blessings will remain if the covenant is renewed properly. When she finished speaking, the church fell silent. Elena could see the villagers processing what they'd heard, reconciling it with their own experiences, with stories their grandparents might have told them. The merchant stood up, his face still skeptical. This sounds like superstition to me. Old folk tales. How do we know any of this is true? Before Elena could respond, old Rodrigo rose shakily to his feet. I know it's true because I've seen the covenant's effects throughout my life. When I was a boy, a terrible storm came that should have destroyed our village, but it split around us, leaving Punta Verde untouched while neighboring towns were devastated. Others began to speak up, sharing stories of inexplicable good fortune, of healing, of protection that had blessed the village over generations. Luisa added her voice. Look at what's happened these past days. Have we not all benefited? My daughter can breathe freely for the first time in her life. Our crops grow as never before. The fish fill our nets. Slowly, Elena saw doubt transforming into acceptance on most faces. Even the merchant seemed less certain in his opposition. By the time the meeting ended, many who had been frightened now approached her with tentative smiles, offering their support for the evening's ritual. As twilight approached, Elena made her final preparations. Dressed in a simple white dress that had belonged to Maria, she placed the 4 elements in a small bag. The emerald snake led the way as she began the climb toward the sacred cave, followed by a procession of villagers bearing torches. To her surprise, nearly the entire village had chosen to accompany her. Even the merchant walked among them, though he maintained a healthy distance from the snake. Father Thomas walked directly behind Elena, carrying a small silver cross alongside the pagan elements of the ritual, a visible symbol of the village's unified approach to faith. The climb was arduous in the fading light. By the time they reached the stone arch marking the cave entrance, full darkness had fallen, with only the torches and the snake's glow illuminating their path. Only the keeper can enter, Elena explained as they reached the sacred site. The rest of you should wait, here. The villagers arranged themselves in a half-circle around the cave entrance. Father Thomas began a prayer, and others joined in with older chants that some remembered from childhood, songs disguised as lullabies that actually honored the covenant. With Indur, the emerald snake leading the way, Elena entered the cave alone. Inside, she found the small chamber with the stone altar transformed. The walls seemed to shimmer with faint lights, like stars brought down to earth. The pool in the center reflected the full moon perfectly, though the cave roof should have blocked any view of the sky. Following the instructions from the journals, Elena placed each element in its proper position. The deep water in the north, the high soil in the south, the eternal flame in the east, and the snake's scale in the west. The emerald snake coiled itself in the center, its body forming a perfect circle. As moonlight reached its peak, streaming impossibly into the cave, Elena began to recite the ancient words. The language felt strange in her mouth, yet somehow familiar, as if her body remembered what her mind had never known. With each phrase, the elements began to glow more intensely, their light merging with the snake's emerald radiance. Outside, the villagers gasped as the cave entrance filled with brilliant green light. Inside, Elena continued the ritual, her voice growing stronger as she felt power flowing through her. Not her own power, but something ancient and benevolent that used her as its channel. The final words of the ritual fell from her lips, just as the moon reached its zenith. The light from the 4 elements shot upward, meeting in a blinding flash above the snake. Elena fell to her knees, temporarily blinded. When her vision cleared, she was no longer alone in the cave. Maria stood before her, not as the frail old woman who had died, but in her prime, vibrant and strong. Beside her stood another woman who resembled Elena herself, though dressed in clothing from another century. And behind them, a line of women stretching back into shadows, each with the same determined eyes and gentle hands. "The keepers," Elena whispered. Maria smiled. "You've done well, my dear. The covenant is renewed. What happens now?" Elena asked. "Now we complete the transition," Maria replied. "My spirit has remained caught between worlds until this moment. With the ritual complete, I can move on. But first, I must transfer the full power of the Guardian to you." Maria gestured toward the emerald snake, which had begun to glow so brightly that its individual scales were no longer visible, just pure green light in serpent form. "Return to the village," Maria instructed. "Bring my body to this cave. The final transformation must take place at dawn." Elena emerged from the cave to find the villagers waiting anxiously. She explained what needed to be done, and without question, they formed a solemn procession back to the village. At the church, Maria's coffin, which had remained unburied during the strange events, was carefully lifted by 6 strong men who began the arduous task of carrying it up to the sacred cave. Throughout the night they worked, the entire village participating, passing the coffin from hand to hand up the steep path. Just before dawn, they placed it inside the cave beside the altar where the emerald snake waited. As the first ray of morning sun somehow penetrated the cave, Elena completed the final words of the ritual. The snake moved to the coffin, slithering inside to coil once more around Maria's body. What happened next defied explanation. Maria's body and the snake began to glow with such intensity that everyone had to shield their eyes. Those closest to the cave entrance later described how Maria's form seemed to dissolve into thousands of luminous particles that merged with the snake's light. A sound like distant music filled the air as the light coalesced, reshaping itself. The snake's form elongated, sprouted what looked like feathered wings, and rose into the air above the astonished villagers. The winged serpent, neither fully snake nor fully bird, but something magical and ancient, circled 3 times above the village. With each pass it glowed more brilliantly, until it seemed like a second sun had appeared in the sky. Then, with a sound like joyous laughter, it soared upward and disappeared into the clouds. Elena stood at the cave entrance, tears streaming down her face, tears of both loss and wonder. She could feel something new inside her, a connection to the earth and sea and sky that hadn't been there before. The full power of the keeper had awakened within her. In the days that followed, the village gradually returned to normal, or a new version of normal. The miraculous abundance continued, though in less dramatic fashion. The unsettling phenomena ceased, objects no longer moved on their own, and the dreams of Maria faded. Elena took up residence in Maria's cottage, learning more each day from the journals and from her own growing intuition. Villagers came to her as they once had to Maria, seeking healing and advice. Even the merchant eventually acknowledged that whatever power protected their village, it seemed to be benevolent. On clear nights, especially when the moon was full, villagers sometimes looked up to see a new constellation in the sky, one that had never been recorded by any astronomer. It had the shape of a winged serpent, its stars glowing with a faint green tinge, watching over their homes. And sometimes, when Elena sat alone in her garden at twilight, she could swear she heard Maria's voice on the wind, whispering guidance, reminding her that she was never truly alone. The covenant endured, the village prospered, and the bridge between worlds remained intact, all because a large snake had appeared in a coffin, setting in motion events that were truly inexplicable.